The gun was already in Mabel Hart's hand before the man finished speaking. She stood in the center of Dust Creek's main street, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her gray eyes narrowed to something cold and absolute. The afternoon sun hammered down on the cracked earth around her boots, and the whole town had gone silent, every soul pressing themselves into doorways or ducking behind water troughs, because everyone in Dust Creek knew what that look meant. They had seen it before. They had hoped they would never see it again. "Say that name one more time," Mabel said, her voice low and perfectly controlled in a way that was somehow more terrifying than any scream. "Say it, and I will make sure you regret every single breath you wasted in this valley." The man across from her, a hired gun named Roy Pickett with sweat already beading on his forehead despite the bravado he had walked in with, took a step backward. He was supposed to deliver a message. He was supposed to frighten her off, to send her riding north before sundown and never looking back. That was what Silas Rowe had paid him to do. But Silas Rowe had not warned him about the specific quality of stillness that Mabel Hart carried in her body when she was truly, deeply furious. It was not the stillness of hesitation. It was the stillness of a woman who had already made every decision that needed making. "Miss Hart," Roy said, trying to recover some thread of dignity, "Mr. Rowe just wants you to understand that your presence here is dangerous to him," Mabel finished. "I know. That is precisely why I am staying. 3 months." That was how long she had been back in Dust Creek. Back in the valley she had ridden away from 6 years ago with nothing but a stolen horse and the kind of grief that leaves permanent marks on a person's bones. She had come back because of a letter. A letter written in the shaking handwriting of old Me Dunbar, the only woman in the valley who had ever been kind to her, telling her that the land her father had worked his whole life was being stolen piece by piece, that the man responsible was the same man who had destroyed her family, and that Me herself was scared. Mabel had read that letter sitting in a boarding house in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the spring of 1882. She had read it twice. Then she had folded it carefully, tucked it into the inside pocket of her coat, and started packing. She was 27 years old. She had spent the better part of a decade learning how to survive, how to shoot, how to read people before they showed you their teeth. She had done things she was not proud of. She had survived things that should have broken her. And she had carried the weight of what happened in Dust Creek Valley like a stone lodged directly behind her sternum, impossible to remove, impossible to ignore. She was not going anywhere, not until every person who had wronged her was gone from this valley. But she had not counted on Charles Walker. She had first seen him 3 days after her arrival, when she had ridden into the yard of what used to be the Hart homestead, and found a tall man with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair streaked through with early threads of silver replacing boards on the fence line. He was maybe 30, 31, she had guessed. He moved with the easy competence of someone who had been working land his whole life, but there was something watchful in the way he held himself, something careful. He had looked up when she approached, his dark eyes steady and unhurried, and he had said nothing for a moment, just looked at her the way you look at something unexpected but not entirely surprising. "This is Hart land," she had told him, reining in her horse. "I know," he had said. "Then you know you should not be on it." "I am not on it for myself," he had replied. "Old Me Dunbar asked me to keep an eye on things. She was worried someone would tear the fence down before the rightful owner came back." Mabel had stared at him, something shifted in her chest, something she did not entirely trust. "You knew I was coming." "Me was hopeful," he had said simply. "There is a difference." She had not known what to do with that. She still did not entirely know what to do with Charles Walker, 3 months later, standing in the middle of the street with a hired gun backing away from her and the whole town watching, because she could feel him somewhere behind her. She could feel his presence the way you feel weather changing, something in the air that your body registers before your mind catches up. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Roy Pickett until he turned and walked, then trotted, then practically ran toward the stable where his horse was tied, and she watched him go with a steady gaze until he had ridden north out of town, and the dust of his departure settled back to earth. Then she lowered her gun and let herself breathe. "One day," said a voice from the boardwalk behind her, "someone is going to call that bluff." She turned. Charles Walker was leaning against one of the support posts outside the general store, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that occupied the specific territory between concern and admiration that she had come to recognize as distinctly his. "It was not a bluff," she said. "I know," he replied. "That is what worries me." She crossed the street and stopped a few feet from him, pushing her hair back off her face. Up close, she could see the tension he was trying to keep out of his posture. He had heard the confrontation from inside the store, she realized. He had probably started moving the moment Roy Pickett opened his mouth. The fact that he had managed to stay back and let her handle it herself said more about his understanding of her than most people accumulated in years. "Rowe is escalating," she said. "He is scared," Charles replied. "He knows you have been talking to Judge Harmon. He should be scared. That land deed he filed is fraudulent. I have 3 witnesses now who will say so to the judge's face." Charles was quiet for a moment. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Mabel," he said, and the way he said her name with that particular weight he gave it made her throat tighten in a way she did not appreciate. "I need you to understand that Silas Rowe is not the kind of man who waits for a judge to decide things against him. I know what kind of man he is. Do you know he has brought in 4 more guns from Tucson in the last week? That was new information." She let herself process it, kept her face neutral. "How do you know that?" "Because I was in Tucson 2 weeks ago on ranch business, and I saw them at the saloon there. Recognized one of them from a job in Colorado that went badly for everyone involved. They are not here for cattle work." She held his gaze. "When were you going to tell me this?" "I am telling you now." He pushed off the post and straightened to his full height. He was several inches taller than her, broad-shouldered, with work-roughened hands and a directness in his eyes that she had come to depend on in ways she was not always comfortable admitting. "I am also telling you that going at Rowe alone, the way you were planning to, is no longer a viable strategy. I have been doing fine so far. You have been lucky so far." He held up a hand before she could respond. "And skilled. You are skilled, Mabel, no one is disputing that. But 4 more guns changes the arithmetic considerably." She stood in the dust of Dusk Creek's main street and looked at him and felt, not for the first time, the uncomfortable sensation of wanting to trust someone completely and being afraid to. She had been burned by trust before. She had learned its cost. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I am suggesting," he said carefully, "that you let me help you." The afternoon sun was beginning to angle toward evening, painting the valley's far ridgeline in shades of amber and rust. Somewhere down the street, a door opened and then closed again as someone decided the dramatic moment had passed. A horse shifted at its hitching post. The ordinary world resumed its turning, indifferent to the weight of what was being offered in that dusty street, and Mabel Hart looked at Charles Walker and tried to decide, as she had been trying to decide for 3 months now, how much of herself it was safe to let him see. The story, the real story, began 12 years before Roy Pickett backed away from a woman with a gun and a grudge. It began in the winter of 1870, when Mabel Hart was 15 years old, and the valley was still something that deserved to be called beautiful. Her father, James Hart, had come to the Dust Creek Valley in 1861, the year the war broke out. A man who wanted nothing to do with battles and everything to do with land. He had worked a homestead in southern New Mexico territory, carved it out of rock and scrub and sheer stubbornness, and by the time Mabel was old enough to understand what he had built, she understood also that he had built it with everything he had, with the same marrow-deep love that he poured into raising her after her mother died of fever when Mabel was 7. James Hart had been a quiet man with a gift for patience and an absolute, bedrock decency that was somewhat rare in the territory. He paid his debts. He kept his word. He treated the Navajo families whose traditional lands bordered his with respect rather than resentment, which was also somewhat unusual. He had one friend he trusted completely, a man named Silas Rowe, who owned a saloon and a small cattle operation and who James had known since before either of them came west. The betrayal, when it came, was therefore not merely a crime. It was a desecration. In December of 1870, James Hart died. The official version, the version that Silas Rowe told, and that the local men with the authority to make things official accepted, was that James had suffered a fall from his horse during an early winter storm and had not survived the injuries. The horse had been found. James had been found. There was an inquest that lasted less than a day, conducted by a justice of the peace who, Mabel would later discover, owed Silas Rowe a significant sum of money. Mabel had been 15, and she had known immediately, with the certainty that lives in the gut rather than the brain, that her father had not fallen from his horse. James Hart had been the best rider in the valley. He had ridden through worse storms than the one that supposedly killed him. And in the 3 days before his death, he had been frightened. She had seen it in him, that specific quality of a careful man who has realized he is in danger. She had tried to ask him about it, and he had deflected with a quietness that meant he was trying to protect her. She had not been protected. She had been removed. 2 weeks after James Hart's death, with the land deed already somehow transferred through a process Mabel would spend years unpacking, Silas Rowe had arranged for Mabel to be sent east, to a distant relation in Missouri she had never met. He had done it through the local minister, Reverend Gill, as a matter of charity. An orphaned girl needed a proper home. The valley was no place for a child alone. She had fought it. She had screamed and wept and refused, and finally been physically placed on a stage by the Reverend and 2 other men she had trusted, men who had known her father, men who now looked at her with their eyes slightly away from her face, which was the look of people who know they are doing wrong but have decided the price of doing right is too high. Missouri had been cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather. The distant relation, a woman named Agnes who kept a boarding house, had not been cruel exactly, but she had been entirely indifferent to the specific grief that Mabel carried, and indifference, Mabel discovered, can wound as thoroughly as cruelty if applied consistently over enough time. At 17, she had left Agnes's house and gone to work. She had learned to shoot before she left New Mexico, having been taught by her father with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, and she had spent the intervening years refining that skill along with every other survival tool she could acquire. She had worked as a ranch hand in Texas, as a scout's assistant in Kansas, as a messenger in the Arizona Territory. She had built a life that was hard and mobile and occasionally dangerous and entirely her own, and she had never stopped planning to come back. Me Dunbar's letter had simply provided the catalyst. Me had been her father's nearest neighbor, a widow who had grown late vegetables and dried herbs and who had always had hard candy in her pockets when a young Mabel came visiting. Me had watched what happened to the Hart family with a helpless grief, and she had been one of the only people in the valley who had not looked away. Me's letter had told Mabel that the Hart land was being run by a caretaker that Rowe had placed there, that Rowe had expanded his holdings to nearly half the valley through a series of transactions that Me, in her plain and careful way, described as having the smell of something rotten. It had also told her that Judge Harmon, the federal circuit judge who came through twice a year, had begun asking questions about property records in the territory, and that there might be a window, a legal window, for Mabel to make a claim. Mabel had ridden south from Santa Fe with money she had saved over 10 years, and a set of intentions she kept very clear in her mind. She was going to reclaim her father's land. She was going to expose Silas Rowe. She was going to hold accountable every person who had looked away while a 15-year-old girl was stripped of her home and her inheritance and sent into exile. She had not planned on finding Charles Walker replacing fence boards with the careful competence of a man who had been asked to preserve something worth preserving. Charles Walker had come to the Dust Creek Valley 2 years before Mabel's return. He had come from Colorado, he told people, And that was true enough to be technically accurate and incomplete enough to be misleading, which was a distinction Mabel understood well and respected in its own way. He had purchased a small cattle operation in the valley's eastern edge, a modest spread with good grass and access to water, and he had worked it with two hired hands named Elliot and Bud, who were loyal to him in the way that people are loyal to someone who has treated them decently, in conditions where decent treatment was not guaranteed. He had known about the Hart situation because Mee Dunbar, who was a woman of considerable information and strategic generosity with that information, had told him about it within a month of his arrival. Mee had, in fact, told him about it in the particular way that people who are hoping something will happen provide information designed to make that thing happen, though at the time, Charles had simply filed it away as context for understanding the valley he now lived in. When Mee's letter to Mabel resulted in Mabel's arrival, Mee had also made sure to mention to Charles that the woman who had ridden in on a gray horse and announced her intention to reclaim the Hart homestead was, in Mee's precise words, the most capable and the most alone person I have ever met, and if you have any sense you will find a reason to be useful. Charles had replaced fence boards. It was as good a reason as any. The history between Charles Walker and the Dust Creek Valley was its own complicated thing. He had come west from Colorado because Colorado had become associated with things he was trying to leave behind, specifically a business partnership with two brothers named Grady and Tom Enfield that had ended in a way that still occupied his nights more than he liked to admit. The Enfield brothers had been involved in land speculation that crossed easily and often into something that had no polite name, and Charles, who had been a legitimately business-minded partner before he understood the full picture of what he was involved in, had ended the partnership the moment he understood it, but ending it had cost him considerably, and the stain of association had been difficult to scrub away. He had come to New Mexico territory because it was far enough from Colorado to be genuinely separate, because the land was honest in the way that demanding land tends to be, and because he had a genuine gift for ranching that satisfied him in the deep practical way that genuine gifts always do. He had no particular design on the territory's politics. He simply wanted to do his work, keep his hands clean, and build something that was recognizably his. Mabel Hart had complicated that plan considerably, and he was finding that he did not entirely mind. The first time he had understood that what he felt for her was not simply respect or concern, which were the words he had been using for the first 2 months, was a night in late May when she had come to his ranch house after dark, riding hard, with a bloodied sleeve and a tightness around her mouth that meant she was working to keep something controlled. She had been ambushed on the road back from Judge Harmon's camp. Not by Rowe's main men, she was certain of that, but by someone opportunistic, someone who wanted to test what she was made of or perhaps deliver a warning on Rowe's behalf without Rowe's direct fingerprints on it. She had handled it, which was evident from the fact that she was there and upright. But the bullet had caught her upper left arm, only a graze but deep enough to need proper attention, and her own attempts to bind it one-handed had been imperfect. She had come to him rather than riding into town, where a doctor would have questions, and those questions would have audiences. He had understood this without being told. He had cleaned and bound the wound with the methodical care of a man who had doctored ranch injuries for years. She had sat very still through it, which took a particular kind of discipline that he recognized, and she had talked, filling the silence with information rather than vulnerability, updating him on what she had learned from Judge Harmon, what the judge had told her about the property records, what the timeline looked like for the legal challenge she was building. He had listened, concentrating on the wound and on her voice in equal measure, and when he finished tying off the bandage, he had looked up and found her looking at him with an expression that was not the expression she usually kept on her face, which was a controlled and watchful arrangement designed to give nothing away. This was something underneath that, something that looked like it had been waiting for a very long time to find a safe place to exist. "Thank you," she said. "You would have managed," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I did not have to." They were very close in the small lamplight of his kitchen, and the air between them had a quality that neither of them seemed entirely sure how to navigate. He was aware of her with a sharpness that had nothing to do with concern. She was aware of him with a longing she was actively refusing to name. They stayed like that for one careful moment, and then she had looked down at her bandaged arm and started talking again about Judge Harmon, and the moment had passed, or at least been set aside. But it had not gone anywhere. It was still there, every time they were in the same space, growing incrementally more difficult to talk around. The morning after the confrontation with Roy Pickett, Mabel rode out to Mee Dunbar's place before breakfast. Mee's homestead was a mile west of what had been the Heartland, a tidy collection of buildings surrounded by the best vegetable garden in the valley, maintained with the particular ferocity of a woman who has decided that beauty is worth the effort regardless of circumstances. Mee was 82 years old and built like a post, short and straight and immovable. She had keen eyes and a precise mind, and she had been watching the valley's dynamics with the focused attention of a chess player for the better part of 6 decades. When Mabel rode up and tied her horse at the post and came to sit in one of the porch chairs that Mee perpetually kept ready for company, Mee handed her a cup of coffee without ceremony and looked at her for a long moment. "Roy Pickett was in town yesterday," Mee said. "It was not a question." "He was," Mabel said. "He is not likely to come back." "Rowe is trying something different now," Mee said, setting her own cup down on the railing with care. "I heard from the Vasquez family yesterday. He is making offers on their land. Low offers, but he is making them polite and in person, not through hired hands." Mabel's jaw tightened. The Vasquez family, Louis and Carmen Vasquez and their 3 adult children, ran a cattle and horse operation in the valley's southwest corner. They were good people with deep roots in the territory, and their land shared a water source with the Hart homestead. If Rowe got the Vasquez property, he would effectively control the valley's water rights. "How did they respond?" Mabel asked. "Louis told him he would think on it," Mee said, which was not a refusal. Louis is not a fool. He knows what Rowe's offers look like up close. "Louis is not a fool," Mee agreed. "But Louis has 3 children he wants to see have good lives, and Rowe's offer is enough money to do something real with." The problem is not that Louis trusts Rowe. The problem is that Louis is weighing his options against his family, and that is a different kind of calculation. Mabel stared out at the garden, at the precise rows of corn and squash and beans, at the structure and intention of it. "I need to talk to him," she said. "Yes," said Mee. "But carefully. You go in talking about Rowe's crimes, you are asking Louis to take a side in someone else's fight. You go in talking about the valley's future, what it becomes if one man controls the water and the land from end to end. That is Louis's fight too." Mabel looked at the old woman with deep appreciation. "Have I mentioned that you are extraordinarily intelligent?" "Frequently," said Mee, picking up her coffee. "I am also, since we are having honest conversations this morning, going to tell you that you should let Charles Walker help you the way he is trying to." Mabel's expression shifted very slightly. "I am not discussing Charles Walker," she said. "I know you are not," Mee replied, serene as a mountain lake. "I am discussing him. You do not have to say anything." "I have watched you carry everything alone for your entire life, Mabel, because carrying it alone was the only way to be sure it got done right, and I understand that. Your father was the same way. But your father also kept Silas Rowe as his only close friend, and you know now how that ended." "That is not a parallel argument," Mabel said. "It is not identical, no. Charles Walker is not Silas Rowe. That is rather my point." Mee set her cup down again and looked at Mabel with an expression of such direct and ancient kindness that it was almost physically difficult to hold. "He has been here 2 years. He has not once done anything that was not straight. He fixes things. He keeps his word. He has turned down 2 separate offers from Rowe's people that I know of, and he turned them down without making noise about it, which is actually harder than it sounds." Mabel was quiet. The morning sun moved through the garden with its ordinary golden patience. "He came here to help with the fence," she said finally, "because you asked him." "Yes," said me, "but he stayed for his own reasons." Me smiled, small and certain. "Yes," she said again. Mabel rode to the Vasquez property that afternoon. She found Luis Vasquez repairing a water pump in the yard. A large, careful man in his early 50s with calloused hands, and the quiet dignity that comes from having built something substantial in difficult circumstances. Carmen came out of the house when she heard the horse, wiping flour from her hands, and they all sat on the porch in the heat of the afternoon and talked. Mabel did not mention Silas Rowe for the first 40 minutes. She talked about the valley, about water rights under territorial law, about what a single owner controlling the valley's primary water source would mean for every other operation, for the ability to negotiate, to grow, to pass land to the next generation. She talked about the legal challenge she was building with Judge Harmon, about the property record irregularities that the judge had confirmed he was investigating, about the particular legal fragility of deeds that had been filed during periods of what the judge delicately called administrative inconsistency. Lewis listened with the quality of attention that serious men give to things they need to fully understand. Carmen asked two very sharp questions about water rights that told Mabel she had been thinking about this already. Their eldest son, Rodrigo, who had come in from the fields partway through the conversation, sat on the porch steps and said nothing but was clearly processing everything. "What are you asking us to do?" Lewis said at last. "Wait," Mabel said. "Do not sell to Rowe while the legal challenge is active. If the challenge succeeds, the property values in this valley stabilize and you can negotiate from a position of strength. If it fails, you still have time to reconsider his offer. And if it fails and Rowe decides to make things difficult for people who did not help him," Mabel met his eyes directly. "That is a real risk," she said. "I am not going to tell you otherwise. Silas Rowe is a man who keeps score, but I believe that being on the side of legitimate legal process with a federal judge involved limits his ability to act against you without creating serious problems for himself." Lewis looked at Carmen. Some wordless conversation passed between them. Rodrigo picked at the edge of the porch step with the controlled energy of someone waiting. "Give us a week to decide," Lewis said. "Of course," Mabel replied. She rode back toward the Hart homestead as the sun began to lower, feeling the slight throb of her healing arm under its bandage and the larger, weightier thrum of everything that was in motion around her. The legal challenge was real and it was moving, but it was slow, and Rowe was not slow. He was a man who had spent 12 years building something on a foundation of fraud and fear, and he knew what happened to buildings with those foundations when someone competent started examining them. She was almost back to the homestead when she saw Charles's horse tied at her gate. He was on the porch, sitting in the chair near the door, and he stood when he heard her approach with that easy, unhurried movement that she had come to recognize. He had been waiting, she could tell, not with impatience but with the settled quality of a person who has decided something and is comfortable with the decision. "The 4 guns from Tucson are at Rowe's ranch," he said as she dismounted. "Elliot rode by this morning on his way to the river. He counted them in the yard. All 4. All 4. There are also 2 men I do not recognize who were not there a week ago." He looked at her with that particular focused concern that he wore when he was about to say something she might not want to hear. "Mabel, I think Rowe is planning to move sooner than you expect, before the judge's next circuit." She tied her horse and came up the porch steps. They were close in the remaining warmth of the afternoon. "His next circuit is in 3 weeks, she said. "I know. I need those 3 weeks for the legal case to hold." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "I have already spoken to Elliot and Bud. They will back whatever you decide. And there are 2 other ranchers in the valley, the mayor's brothers on the north end, who I believe would stand with you if the situation required it." She looked up at him. "You have been organizing this without telling me." "I have been making contingency arrangements," he said carefully. "Nothing is committed. No one has been promised anything in your name. If you tell me to undo it, I will ride to every one of them tomorrow and undo it." She breathed. The evening air smelled of sage, and the particular dry sweetness of this valley that she had carried in her memory for 12 years. She had dreamed about this smell sometimes in Missouri, in Texas, in all the places she had been that were not here. It was the smell of home, inseparable from grief and love in a way that made both of them almost unbearable. "You are doing this because you believe in the case," she said slowly. "Or are you doing it because you are worried about me?" He held her gaze with a steadiness that did not flinch. "Both," he said, "and I am not going to apologize for either." Something in her chest did a complicated thing. She turned away slightly, looking out at the valley stretching below in the falling light, the scrub and rock and grass, the distant glint of the water in the creek, the long ridgeline turning from amber to purple. "I have not let anyone help me in a very long time," she said. "I know," he said. "It is not that I do not want to. I know that too." She turned back and looked at him, and this time she let herself look without the careful management she usually applied, without the consideration of what she was giving away. He was looking at her the same way. That same quality of attention that was not simple concern, that was not simply practical alliance, that was something older and more fundamental than either of those things. "3 weeks," she said. "I need 3 weeks." "Then that is what we will work with," he replied. They worked. The 2 weeks that followed were the most intense of Mabel's time in the valley, a relentless forward movement that required her to be 6 things at once: strategist, negotiator, investigator, and the walking symbol of the possibility that Silas Rowe could be stopped. She rode between homesteads, compiled testimony, coordinated with the judge's deputy who had arrived to begin preliminary document review. She found 2 more witnesses she had not expected: a former employee of Rowe's named Frank Delgado, who had kept records that Rowe had believed were destroyed, and a woman named Sarah Combs, who had been the bookkeeper at Rowe's saloon in 1870, and who had never forgotten the numbers she had seen that winter. Charles was simultaneously building a different kind of architecture. He was not visible in Mabel's legal proceedings. He understood without being told that the case needed to be hers, needed to carry her name and her standing, needed to be the fruit of her own persistent righteous labor, rather than a transaction that someone else engineered on her behalf. But around the edges and underneath, he was building the safety net. He rode to the mayor's brothers and had frank conversations about what might be needed. He kept Elliot and Bud informed and ready. He made sure that when Rowe's hired guns made their presence felt by riding through the valley in ways designed to intimidate, there was always someone who could credibly indicate that they were not the only organized force in the territory. He was also, increasingly, at Mabel's table in the evenings. Not every evening, maybe 3 times in that first week, then 4, then every other night. It began practically: the need to exchange information, to coordinate, to review what had happened that day and plan for what needed to happen next. But it became also something else, gradually, the way the tide changes, through increments so small that each individual one is invisible. She had started cooking for 2 without noticing she had started. She told herself it was efficient. He brought coffee the nights he came over, good coffee from the general store, and she told herself that was simply thoughtful rather than meaningful. They sat across the table from each other in the lamplight and talked, and sometimes the talking was logistics, and sometimes the talking was the other kind, the kind where you trace the outlines of who a person is. He told her about the Enfield brothers. He told it plainly and without excuses, what he had known and when, and what he had done when he understood fully. She listened without judgment, and with the specific recognition of a person who knows what it is to be in proximity to corruption, and to have to decide how to respond to it. He had made the harder choice at a real cost, and the stain of association had followed him west, which was part of why he kept himself slightly apart from the valley's social life. She told him about Missouri, About Agnes and the boarding house and the particular cold of being sent away by people who had known her father and could not quite meet her eyes. She had not talked about Missouri in years. The words came out differently than she expected, not with the armor she usually kept around that time, but with something underneath, the armor that she had not heard herself access in a long time. He did not offer comfort in the form of easy words. He listened, and when she finished he said, quietly and factually, "You should not have had to carry that. It was the right thing." Sympathy she could deflect. Acknowledgement of the actual wrongness of it, stated plainly, landed somewhere different. The evening before Judge Harmon's circuit arrival, Mabel was sitting on the Hart homestead's porch in the last of the light, going through her compiled documents for the final time, when she heard a horse approaching from the east in a way that was not casual. She was on her feet and inside the door before the rider was visible, watching through the gap in the doorframe with her hand on her gun. It was Rodrigo Vasquez, riding hard. She came back out when she recognized him. He had barely pulled his horse to a stop before he was talking. "Rowe's men took Frank Delgado," he said. "2 hours ago, his wife came to our place. She said 4 men came to his house and they took him and did not say where." Mabel's blood went cold. "Is she safe? My mother has her. She is frightened." "Rodrigo," she caught his eyes and held them. "Listen to me carefully. Go back to your family and stay there tonight. Do not go to Rowe's ranch. Do not confront anyone. Can you do that?" He wanted to argue, she could see it, the young man's urge to do something immediate and physical, but he was sensible enough to defer. He nodded. The moment he was riding back, she was already saddling her horse. She had one stop to make before she did anything else. Charles's ranch house was lit when she arrived, which meant he was still up. She tied her horse in record time and knocked. He opened the door 1 second before she would have knocked a second time, took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him, fast and precise. She watched him absorb it, watched his jaw tighten, watched him make decisions in real time. "Rowe cannot have Delgado killed before the judge arrives," Charles said. "It would be the worst possible timing for him. This is a pressure move to scare Delgado into recanting or disappearing, which means he may be willing to release him if he believes the evidence survives Delgado's absence. It might also mean he is past caring about timing." They looked at each other in the lamplight of his doorway. "I cannot let this go unaddressed tonight," she said. "I know." He turned back into the house and she heard him opening the cabinet where she knew he kept his rifle. "You are not going alone." She almost said something. The automatic mechanism that made her want to handle things alone, to not be responsible for someone else's safety, to not accept help that could turn into debt or complication or loss, tried to reassert itself. "No," she said instead. "I am not." They rode to Rowe's ranch together with Elliot and Bud riding behind them, having been woken with minimal ceremony. The night was clear and cool, the territory showing its stars with the extravagance it always did, and Mabel rode with the settled intentionality of a woman who has resolved the question of what she is doing even if she has not yet resolved all the questions of how it will go. Rowe's ranch was lit when they arrived. The light of several lanterns, including the bunkhouse and the main house, which was not the arrangement of a place where people had gone to bed. 2 of Rowe's men were in the yard, and they went for their guns before they recognized the group, and then they went still in the way that people go still when the arithmetic of a situation shifts in a direction they had not expected. Mabel did not slow her horse. She rode into the yard and stopped in front of the main house and called out, loud and clear, "Silas Rowe, come outside." Nothing happened for 15 seconds. Then the door opened. Silas Rowe was a man in his mid-50s, thickened with prosperity, with a beard that had gone gray and pale eyes that had the flat, practical quality of someone who had decided long ago that other people were primarily instruments. He had been handsome once, perhaps. He was now simply powerful in the way that men who have spent decades taking what they wanted tend to be, wearing it like a second skin. He looked at Mabel and something moved in those flat eyes that was more than he intended to show. "Mabel Hart," he said. He said it with an attempt at ease, but there was something underneath it that she had not heard before, something that was close to fear. "Frank Delgado," she said. "Now, I do not know what you are, do not." Her voice cut across the quiet night with a precision that silenced everything. "Do not perform ignorance for me, Silas. I am not a 15-year-old you can put on a stage and ship away. Delgado is a witness in a federal legal proceeding. What has been done to him tonight is a crime against federal process, and Judge Harmon arrives tomorrow morning. You can release him right now, tonight, unharmed, and we will add this to the list of your offenses for the judge to consider, or you can make this worse." A long silence stretched across the yard. Rowe looked at her. He looked at Charles, at Elliot and Bud, at something in the yard behind them that she realized was the Mayer brothers who had apparently been watching and had decided to be present. She had not known they would come. She suspected Charles had sent word before she arrived at his door. Rowe looked back at Mabel. "You have been building this for 12 years, he said. It was almost conversational. "You are like your father, he would not leave things alone either." "My father trusted you," she said. "That cost him his life. I have never been inclined to repeat his mistakes." Something flickered in Rowe's expression. Not remorse. She did not think he had the capacity for it, but perhaps the recognition that the game had moved beyond his control, that all the hired guns in Tucson could not undo what was already in motion. He turned back into the house without another word. 3 minutes later, Frank Delgado appeared in the doorway, shaken but upright, with no visible serious injury. Mabel exhaled slowly and said quietly to Charles beside her, "Take him to the Vasquez place." "On it," Charles said. Judge Harmon arrived the following morning as scheduled, riding in on the Santa Fe stage with 2 deputies and a case full of documents that his office had spent the last month reviewing. The proceedings, conducted formally in the territory's courthouse building in Dust Creek, took 4 days. Mabel was present for all of it. She presented her case, her testimony, the testimonies of Me Dunbar and Frank Delgado and Sarah Combs and Luis Vasquez, and 3 other residents of the valley who had come forward in the final days with information they had been too frightened to share, until the weight of federal process made it feel possible. She was precise and prepared, and she let the evidence speak with the kind of clarity that comes from 12 years of accumulated, focused purpose. The fraudulent land deed for the Hart homestead was ruled void on the 3rd day. The broader investigation into Rowe's property acquisitions was referred to a territorial court for full review, a process that would take months and that Rowe's lawyer, who had ridden in from Albuquerque, immediately began trying to complicate. On the 4th day, Silas Rowe was taken into federal custody on charges of fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and interference with a federal proceeding. This last charge related to Frank Delgado. His hired guns from Tucson were confronted by the judge's deputies and given a direct choice between riding out of the territory and facing accessory charges. They rode. Reverend Gill, long since moved from the valley to a parish in El Paso, was not present to face charges. He had died 4 years prior, which Mabel acknowledged in the quiet of her own interior with a complicated feeling that was not quite justice and not quite peace, but was something in between. She had learned not to need everything to be perfectly resolved. She had learned that living people with honest reckoning were sometimes all you got, and it was enough. The 2 other men who had helped load her onto the stage in 1870, both of them still in the valley and considerably aged, came to her separately in the days after the ruling. One of them, a man named Harold Birch, came with his hat in his hand and tears on his face and a quavering explanation about what Rowe had held over him that Mabel listened to in full before saying simply, "I hear you. Live better from here." The other, a man named Pete Calhoun, did not come to her. She saw him in the street once and he crossed to the other side. That was its own kind of answer. It was enough. It was not perfect, but it was enough. On the evening of the 4th day, after the judge's proceedings had concluded and the public building had emptied, and the town of Dust Creek had gone through the particular loud communal release of a community that has been held under tension, and suddenly feels it lift. Mabel sat on the porch of the Hart homestead and let herself feel what she had not allowed herself to feel through any of it. The grief for her father, which had been her engine for so long that she had confused it with herself, sat now in her chest not as fuel but as sorrow. Plain, clean, bearable sorrow. James Hart had been a good man who had been betrayed by someone he trusted and had not deserved what happened to him, and no ruling or legal proceeding would change that. But the record now said clearly that he had been wronged, and there was a dignity to that, a restoration of the truth about who he was that Mabel had not fully understood she needed until she felt the weight of it settle into its proper place. She was crying, she realized. Quietly, without drama, with the particular release of a pressure that has been maintained so long that the body almost does not know what to do without it. Charles found her there. He had come from town, she could tell from the dust on his clothes. He came up the porch steps and sat in the other chair without being invited, which she had stopped minding weeks ago. He looked at her and she looked at him, and she did not try to do anything with her face. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She looked out at the valley in the evening light, the same light it had always had, the same quality of gold and amber that she had stored in her memory for 12 years. And she thought about her father working this land, and about the years of his work that she had absorbed simply by being near him, the patience and the decency and the deep belief that the valley was worth loving. "I do not know who I am," she said, "if this is not the thing I am doing." Charles turned slightly to look at her more directly. "What do you mean?" "I have been coming back here for 12 years, she said. "Inside myself, in my plans, this was the thing that organized everything else. And now it is finished and I am sitting here and I do not know what comes next." He was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "You have a homestead to rebuild, land that was your father's to work. A woman with your capabilities in this valley is not going to run short of things to do. That is practical," she said, with the faintest trace of something dry. "I am a practical person," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that same steady, dark-eyed attention, the one she had been trying to navigate around for 3 months, and she was too tired tonight in the good, particular way of someone who has finished something huge to keep navigating around it. "I have been afraid," she said, "of what it would mean to want something for myself, after the case, after the land, to want something that was just mine, not in service of anything larger." "That is not a strange thing to be afraid of," he said. "It is strange to be 27 years old and not have any practice at it." He moved slightly in his chair, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. In the fading light he looked like exactly what he was, a man who had made his own difficult choices and lived with the consequences and built something from what remained, and she felt a deep kinship with that went beyond anything she could have explained to anyone who had not done the same. "Mabel," he said. "Do not say something careful," she said. He stopped. "I am tired of careful," she said. "I have been careful about this for 3 months. I am tired of pretending I do not know what this is." He held her gaze. Something in him shifted, some last careful thing set down. "Then I will not say something careful," he said. "I will tell you that I came to this valley to get away from something, and I found, fairly immediately, that I was moving toward something instead. That I have spent 3 months trying to be useful to you without making you feel managed or pressured or like the help came with claims attached. And that I would like very much to have dinner with you tomorrow night that has nothing to do with legal strategy." She breathed. The valley was deepening into its evening colors, purple and indigo coming up from the east, the sky still burning in the west. Somewhere down the creek, a night bird was beginning to test its voice. "Dinner," she said. "To start," he said. She felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. Not the grief lifting, that was already happening. This was different. This was the space that opened when the grief finished its residency and you discovered there was room underneath it for something else entirely. "Dinner," she said again, and this time she let herself smile. He smiled back, slow and genuine, and entirely without the guardedness either of them usually maintained, and she thought, with the slightly dizzy quality of a person encountering their own future earlier than expected, that this was what it looked like when something began rather than ended. The dinner was on Saturday evening. It had nothing to do with legal strategy. Mabel had not been sure what to do with herself for the whole day beforehand, which was novel enough to be slightly alarming, having so thoroughly organized her life around a single driving purpose for so long that leisure felt foreign. She cleaned the homestead, which needed it. She repaired a shutter hinge that had been loose since she arrived. She spent an hour with me Dunbar in the afternoon, ostensibly discussing the vegetable garden, but actually, she admitted to herself, in the company of someone whose calm made her own less disciplined internal weather easier to manage. Me had asked nothing about Charles. Me had simply looked at Mabel over the tops of her bean plants with an expression of deep satisfaction, and handed her a jar of good preserves to take home. He arrived at the homestead in the early evening, dressed in clean clothes, having ridden in on his good horse rather than the working one, and carrying 2 bottles of wine from the general store's limited but serviceable selection. She met him on the porch, and they looked at each other with the slight nervous quality of 2 capable people who are not entirely used to being nervous about anything and find it disorienting. "You look different," he said. "I am not wearing a gun," she said. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh openly before, she realized, not without some concern operating underneath it. This was different. This was just a man laughing, and it did something to the air around him that made him more rather than less of what he already was. They ate at the table in the homestead's kitchen, the same table where her father had sat, where she had done her childhood lessons by lamplight. She had made a meal that was honest and good, not elaborately performed but genuinely cared about, which felt like the right register for this. He talked about Colorado, filling in the parts he had left out before, and she talked about her years in Texas and what she had learned there about land and about horses, and about the particular solitude of wide-open spaces when you are carrying something unresolved. They were talking about horses when she realized that they had been sitting there for 3 hours and the night had deepened around them without either of them noticing. "You love this land," he said. It was not a question. "I do," she said. "I think I always felt guilty about it, after my father died, like loving it was somehow a failure of grief. That is not how grief works. I know that now." She turned the wine glass slowly in her hands. "What made you stay? After Rowe was arrested, you could leave. The complications you came here to escape are not any more present here than anywhere else." He looked at her across the table with a directness that was the clearest thing she had ever seen. "You know why I stayed," he said. She did know. She had known for some time, in the same way she had known for some time what she felt, in the way that things you keep trying to think your way around eventually just sit there in plain sight waiting for you to stop. She had simply not been ready before now for the immensity of it. She set down her glass and stood, and he rose from his chair in the same motion, and when she crossed the small space between them and his arms came around her, it was with the quality of something arriving rather than something happening, something that had been in transit for a long time, crossing a great distance, reaching its destination with a kind of inevitability that felt, paradoxically, not like fate but like choice. He held her carefully, the way he had held her arm when he bandaged the wound, with the same attention and steadiness, except that this was not about a wound, and she was not trying to maintain careful indifference. She let herself rest her face against his shoulder and breathe. The lamplight was quiet around them. The valley settled into its deep night sounds outside the walls. "I have not done this very often," she said into his shoulder. "Stood in a kitchen," he said, with the same dry humor she had come to love. "Let someone close enough," she said. His arms tightened slightly. "I know," he said. "You do not have to do anything with that except say it." The months that followed, were the most ordinary and the most extraordinary of Mabel Hart's life. She rebuilt the homestead, which needed structural work. She attacked with characteristic thoroughness, hiring 2 carpenters from town and doing as much as she could herself, learning what she did not already know from books and from watching. She filed the formal claim that restored the Hart homestead title to her name, a process that took 2 months of additional legal work, but concluded without serious opposition, Rowe's lawyers having retreated considerably in the face of the territorial court's investigation. Charles helped when she asked him to, and when she did not ask him, he was at his own ranch doing his own work, which was one of the things she found most important about him. He did not hover. He did not manage. He moved through their developing relationship with the same practical respect he brought to everything else, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that love was something she had capacity for that she had not known was there, not because she had been incapable of it, but because there had been no room in the architecture of her focused, purposeful life. There was room now. He asked her in September, 4 months after Rowe's arrest, with characteristic lack of ceremony and characteristic directness, over coffee on the porch of his ranch house on an early morning when the valley was still cool and the light was starting at the eastern ridgeline and spreading. He said he wanted to marry her if she would have him. He said it was not because he thought she needed anything from him, which would have been the wrong reason, but because he wanted to share the particular life she was building, and she was the specific person he wanted to share everything with. She held her coffee cup and looked at the morning light on the ridge and thought about her father and about 12 years, and about what comes after the long thing ends, and she said yes. They were married in November of 1882 at a ceremony held at the Hart homestead, officiated by a circuit preacher and attended by me Dunbar, the Vasquez family, the mayor's brothers, Elliot and Bud, and several other valley residents who had been part of the difficult months and who felt rightfully that this conclusion deserved witnessing. Me cried, which she claimed was due to the wind. Carmen Vasquez brought food enough for 3 times the attendance, which was her particular love language applied to every celebration. The valley was cold and clear, and showed its sky in the deep afternoon blue of a high desert November. Mabel wore a dress that Me had helped her find in the town's single dress shop, a deep green that suited her dark hair and her gray eyes, and that she was only slightly self-conscious in, being more accustomed to practical riding clothes. She carried a small bunch of dried sage from the Hart homestead garden, which had been her mother's plant, a small private ceremony within the larger one. Charles looked at her when she came around the corner of the house and found him standing with the preacher, and the look on his face was the kind that a person carries with them for the rest of their life, the uncomplicated joy of someone exactly where they want to be. She thought, surprising herself, that she had not known this was possible. Not specifically the marriage, though that was part of it, but the quality of arrival that she had carried in his expression. She had lived for 12 years in transit, always oriented toward the next thing, the justice she was working toward, and it had served its purpose and it had brought her here. And here was the Hart homestead on a November afternoon with the man she loved, and the valley her father had loved, and a future that was not defined by what needed to be fixed, but by what was possible. She said her vows with a steady voice, and with everything she had, which was, it turned out, considerably more than she had known. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was a winter that settled into itself the way good winters do in the territory, cold enough to be honest but mild enough to be livable, with stretches of crystalline weather that made the valley look like it was trying to show off. They divided their time between the Hart homestead and Charles's ranch through an arrangement that was partly practical and partly still being worked out, as 2 people with strong habits and independent natures tend to do when they start sharing space on a permanent basis. It was not without friction. Mabel had opinions about how things were done, which was putting it mildly, and Charles had his own ways of managing a ranch that were not always immediately compatible with her ways of managing anything. They argued twice in December, once about something genuinely important to do with the shared water management between their two properties, and once about something that was ostensibly about firewood, but was actually about the larger question of which homestead they were building their primary life around. That second argument was resolved by a conversation that took most of a night and ended with a clarity that neither of them had had before it, which was that they were building a new thing, not inserting one life into the existing structure of another, and that the Hart homestead would be their home because it was where they both wanted it to be, and the Walker Ranch operation would remain because it was productive and good, and there was nothing incompatible about working both. After that conversation, there was less friction, or at any rate more productive friction, the kind that comes from two people who genuinely respect each other trying to figure out how to be built together. It was not always graceful. It was consistently real. In the spring of 1883, the territorial court concluded its review of Rowe's property acquisitions. The findings confirmed what Mabel had argued. Multiple transactions had been conducted fraudulently, with forged documents and coerced parties. Several properties were restored to their prior owners or their heirs. The Vasquez family's neighbor to the north, who had been pressured into selling 3 years earlier, received a settlement that allowed him to buy back a portion of his land. The broader investigation also implicated 2 of the former county officials who had facilitated Rowe's filings, both of whom faced charges. Silas Rowe, awaiting trial in the federal court in Santa Fe, was convicted in July of 1883 on 12 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud. He received a sentence of 12 years. He was 60 years old at sentencing. He would not see the valley again. Mabel heard the verdict from Charles, who had ridden to town for supplies when the telegram from Santa Fe arrived. He told her in the kitchen of the homestead on a summer evening, and she received it standing at the kitchen table with her hands resting on its surface, and she was quiet for a long moment. "Is it enough?" he asked. He asked it gently, knowing it was a real question. "Yes," she said. And then, after a moment, "Yes, it is enough." She had spent so many years with enough as an insufficient answer to things, with the gap between what happened and what justice could actually provide as an open wound. But she had also, in the months of this new life, been learning something about the difference between what you fight for and what you live for. They were not the same thing. The fighting had been necessary, and it had been right, and it had been hers. The living was now, and it was different in quality, rooted rather than driving forward, present rather than oriented toward a future reckoning. Her father's land was her land. The record showed the truth of what had happened. The man responsible was answering for it. These things were not perfect, but they were true, and truth, she had decided, was the thing you were owed, not happiness, which had to be built rather than awarded. She was building it. It turned out to be the most interesting project she had ever undertaken. In the late summer of 1883, she told Charles she was pregnant. She told him on the porch of the homestead on an evening in August, with the heat finally beginning to ease toward something more manageable and the creek visible from the porch in its late summer low. She told him plainly, without preamble, which was her way with things that mattered. He sat very still for 1 second, and then he was beside her with his arms around her and his face in her hair, and a quality of feeling that she could sense running through him like a current, the particular overwhelm of something wanted enough that its arrival is almost too much to absorb. "Are you all right?" he said, pulling back to look at her. "I am perfectly well," she said, which was almost entirely true if you did not count the mornings, which she was managing. "I want to be clear," he said, with the slightly unsteady quality of a man who is trying to be precise while also being very moved, "that you are remarkable, that everything about the way you exist in this world is remarkable, and that this baby is going to be very fortunate to have you." She put her hand against his face and looked at him and felt, in the particular way she had been slowly learning to trust, that the thing she had built was real, that it would hold, that it was worth all the years that preceded it. Me Dunbar came over the next day when she heard, as she somehow always heard things before they were generally communicated. She brought a jar of her best honey and a set of small garments she had evidently already been knitting, which suggested that she had known, or suspected, before Mabel told anyone. Me sat in her chair on the Hart homestead porch and did not say anything particularly dramatic. She held Mabel's hand for a moment and looked at her with the accumulated tenderness of a woman who had known her since she was a small child sitting on this same porch listening to her father talk about the valley, and that was enough. The baby was born in April of 1884, a boy with dark hair and his father's quiet eyes and his mother's stubbornness apparent from approximately the second week of life. They named him James, for Mabel's father. It was not a complicated choice. Charles had suggested it before Mabel had articulated it aloud, which was one of the things about him that she had come to treasure, the way he understood the things she was working toward before she said them. Young James Hartwalker was received by the valley with the warmth that communities tend to give to children who represent continuity and new beginning in equal measure. Me Dunbar pronounced him perfect, which was her standard response to babies she approved of, and gave him a carved wooden toy of mysterious purpose that he would somehow cherish for years. Carmen Vasquez came with more food than 3 families could eat, and declared him the most beautiful child she had seen since Rodrigo, a comparison that made Rodrigo, who was present, roll his eyes with good humor. Motherhood was not what Mabel had expected, in the sense that she had not known what to expect, and had therefore carried a low-grade uncertainty through the pregnancy that the actual experience obliterated. She was good at it in the practical ways and surprised by it in the other ways, by the specific quality of love that it turned out to be, different from every other love she had, wider than she had capacity for, and then revealing that she had more capacity than she had known. The same discovery she had made with Charles, extended, multiplied. She kept working the land through all of it. James came with her on rides when he was old enough to be carried safely, tucked against her in the front of the saddle, learning the valley from above as she had once learned it. He had her father's look of serious attention when he observed things, and she saw James' heart SR in him often enough that it ached in a good way. The homestead expanded in the years that followed. They added to the house twice, once for space and once for the second child, a daughter born in 1886 whom they named Clara. Where James had his father's calm and his mother's stubbornness, Clara had her mother's eyes and a ferocity of personality that announced itself early and thoroughly. She was, in Charles's delighted and slightly exhausted assessment, exactly what the valley needed, and exactly what anyone who spent time with Mabel Hart should have expected. The Walker Ranch operation prospered through the mid-1880s, with good beef prices, and the reliable Elliot and Bud having expanded to a crew of 5, managing a herd that had grown considerably from the original modest operation. Mabel's contribution was practical and ongoing, her eye for the land and water management having turned out to be an asset that made the operation meaningfully more effective. She was not running cattle. She was clear that her primary work was the Hart homestead, but the line between the two properties was increasingly a management concept rather than a reality. They were, by any measure, building something. Me Dunbar lived to see both children. She died in the winter of 1887, at 85, in her own house with her hands on her quilt, and the vegetable garden as put together as she could make it for the season, which was very put together indeed. Mabel sat with her in the last hours, and they talked about things that did not need to be said but that were worth saying, about James Hart SR, and what he had been, about the valley and what it was becoming, about Me's husband who had been dead for 30 years, and whom she expected to find opinions unchanged. The grief of Me's death was clean, the grief of something that had been fully lived. Mabel wept at the funeral and did not hide it, standing with Charles's hand in hers and young James solemn beside her, and Clara not quite understanding, but understanding that it was serious, pressed against her mother's side. She was given Me's garden, by the terms of a will that Me had written with characteristic precision. The vegetable garden and the property around it, left to Mabel Hart, who will understand what it is for and will grow things in it. She did. The winter of 1887 and 1888 was harder than the years before it, a prolonged cold that tested every operation in the territory and resulted in significant cattle losses across the region. It was the kind of hardship that strips away comfort and leaves you with the essential structure of what you have built, and what they had built held. It was difficult, the way genuinely difficult winters are, with shortened tempers and tired bodies, and the grinding work of keeping animals alive in cold that should not have stayed this long. But they were not going under. They had resources and skill, and crucially, they had each other in a way that had by now been tested and confirmed through enough experience that neither of them doubted it. Charles told her, on a night in January of 1888 when they had been out in the cold since before dawn, and had come inside to warmth and food with the bone-deep exhaustion of people who had been equal partners in hard labor, that he thought about the fence boards he had been replacing when she first rode up, and told him it was Heartland. He said it with the specific nostalgic quality that people apply to origin stories, the moment before everything began. I was nervous, he admitted. I had been told to expect someone who knew what she wanted. I was not prepared for how completely that was true. Were you not? She said, sitting across from him with her boots off and a blanket across her lap and a cup of something hot in both hands. I thought I was prepared, he said. I thought I had the general picture. And then you rode up on that gray horse and told me I was on Heartland and looked at me like you were waiting to see if I was going to be worth the time, and I thought, well, what? She said. He looked at her across the warmth of their shared kitchen with the easy, settled affection of a man who has been well loved and knows it. Well, I better be worth the time. She laughed, and he laughed, and outside the January cold pressed against the walls of the Hart homestead without getting in. The spring of 1888 brought recovery, as springs tend to. The valley came back from the hard winter with the insistent green of a land that knows what it is, and the Hart homestead put out its new season with the particular energy of good soil that has been properly tended. The garden, Me's garden, which Mabel had expanded and adapted to her own use while maintaining its essential character, grew better than it ever had. She had taken to growing things with the same systematic intelligence she had brought to the legal case and the land reclamation, learning what the valley's soil wanted and giving it that, and the garden paid her back in the straightforward and satisfying language of things that grow. James was 4 by then, and had developed opinions about the garden that were primarily about which vegetables were acceptable and which were not, a critical assessment that Charles supported in a way that was technically neutral but transparently sided with the child. Clara, who was 2, had not yet formed specific vegetable opinions, but made her position on being picked up and moved clear through volume. Mabel looked at her family on an April evening in 1888, her husband reading by the lamp at the table, while James explained something complicated about the function of the porch step to Clara with the earnest pedagogy of a 4-year-old, and she held it for a moment the way you hold a thing that is genuinely precious, with full attention, and without trying to keep part of yourself back for protection. She had spent most of her life keeping part of herself back. The habit had served her. It had allowed her to function and plan, and endure during years when being fully present to her own life would have been unbearable. But the habit had a cost that she had only fully understood when she began, carefully and with Charles's patient company, to let it go, and the cost was the quality of presence itself, the ability to simply be in the good thing without monitoring the exits. She was getting better at it. She allowed herself to acknowledge, genuinely happy in a way that was not the absence of grief or the completion of a mission but was its own affirmative thing, the thing that happens when you rebuild the structure of your life on true ground and do it with people who are worth building with. What are you looking at? Charles asked, without looking up from his book. You, she said. And the children, and this. He did look up then, and the expression on his face was the same one she had seen on their wedding day, that uncomplicated joy, worn down now by years into something deeper and quieter and more permanent, which she had come to understand was not the diminishment of feeling but its maturation. Good, he said. Very good, she said. They were married 6 years by then. She had reclaimed her father's land. She had seen justice, imperfect and real, done for what had been done to her family. She had rebuilt and replanted and grown and borne 2 children and survived a hard winter and learned how to let someone close enough to matter, which had been the hardest thing and the most important. The valley spread out below the Hart homestead porch in the spring evening light, the same light it had always had, and Mabel Hart Walker sat in it and let herself belong to the place that had always been hers, and let the people inside the house behind her be the people they were to her, which was everything. The story had begun, in the truest sense, with a girl who was 15 years old and being put on a stage against her will, being sent away from a home she loved by people who had decided her grief was inconvenient. It had continued through 12 years of motion, of preparation, of carrying a purpose that was also a wound, of becoming someone who could come back and face what needed facing. And it had brought her here to this porch, to this valley, to this life. She would not have traded the hard years, she had decided. They had made her who she was, and who she was had led her to all of this. The grief and the fighting and the solitude had been real, and they had been genuinely terrible in the ways that genuinely terrible things are, but they had also been the road, and the road had brought her home. James Hart Sr. had believed in this valley with a patience and a love that outlasted his life, that passed into his daughter and lived in her through everything, that had been strong enough to bring her back across 12 years and 1,000 miles to do what needed doing. She thought about him most evenings when the light was like this, when the valley showed itself at its best, and she could feel the accumulated love of the people who had worked this land and wanted good things from it. She thought he would have liked Charles Walker. She thought he would have laughed at James's vegetable opinions and Clara's volume, and been exactly the kind of grandfather who had hard candy in his pockets. She kept that thought close. It did not ache the way it once had. It was simply true, warmly and permanently true, the way all the best things in her life had turned out to be. The Hart homestead stood in the Dusk Creek Valley as it had stood for 20 years, its boards new in some places and original in others, its garden established and its fences straight, its windows lit in the evenings with the warm light of people living their lives in it. The valley around it was not perfect and it was not simple. The territory never was, and would not become so, with all the change and difficulty that the years ahead would bring. But it was genuinely good and genuinely hers, and the man beside her and the children behind her and the land under her feet were all genuinely and permanently real. Mabel Hart had refused to leave the valley until every person who wronged her was gone. They were gone, and she was still here, which had always been the point. Not the going of them, but the staying of her, the reclaiming of the place that was hers, the living of the life that had been taken from her and that she had taken back. She was still here, and she was home.